The Ghost Army. How artists fooled Hitler and saved thousands of lives. The night was silent, yet the ground trembled with tanks that did not exist. Engines roared in the dark, but the sound came from a gramophone. Through the mist of northern France, entire divisions moved, made of air and canvas. This was not a battle fought with bullets. It was fought with brushes, speakers, and illusions. They called themselves the Ghost Army, a secret unit of artists, sound engineers, architects, and stage designers who turned deception into a weapon. Their job? To convince the Nazis that thousands of American troops stood where only a few dozen truly did. Their success saved tens of thousands of lives, but their story was buried for half a century under military secrecy. In this Hidden Frontlines episode, we unveil the invisible division, men who turned the art of illusion into a battlefield tactic. A war fought not for glory, but for belief. Act 1. Artists go to war. Before there were soldiers, there were dreamers, men who could paint clouds, sculpt shadows, and make an audience believe anything was possible. And in 1944, the U.S. Army decided that such dreamers might just be the most dangerous weapon it had. It began with a strange request. Find me men who can draw and make them soldiers. It sounded like a bad joke at first, the kind of thing whispered in New York bars after a few too many whiskeys. But the army wasn't joking. The Allies were advancing across Europe, and deception, the ability to make the Germans look the wrong way, could save thousands of lives. So they gathered an odd mix of recruits: painters, sound engineers, set designers, illustrators, sculptors, and even radio technicians. Many came from the Yale School of Art, Cooper Union, Pratt Institute, and even advertising agencies. They were used to sketching landscapes, not invading them. One man joked, "We joined the army and ended up in the circus." They became the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, though among themselves, they preferred a flashier name, the Ghost Army. Their weapons? Rubber, paint, and sound. Their mission? To convince the Nazis that American divisions existed where none did. Imagine being trained to deploy inflatable tanks instead of firing real ones, to use speakers instead of cannons. Their barracks looked more like a film studio than a military base. Rolls of rubber, barrels of paint, spools of wire, and loudspeakers taller than men. Colonel Harry L. Reeder, a stern but amused commander, oversaw the experiment. "Gentlemen," he told them during their first briefing, "you will be fighting with imagination. Make sure it kills confusion faster than any bullet could." There were painters like Bill Blass, who would later become a famous fashion designer, and sound engineers from Bell Labs, who could make a truck sound like an entire armored convoy. These weren't hardened soldiers, they were magicians of reality, and their art was about to become a matter of life and death. Some nights, as they practiced fake radio chatter in the woods, one artist quipped, "If Hitler ever finds out we're just art students, he might surrender out of embarrassment." The laughter didn't hide the fear, because if the deception failed, they would be the first to die. By mid-1944, they were ready. Their brushes had become bayonets, their microphones artillery. Their mission? To fool the German war machine using the oldest trick in the book, illusion. The stage was set. The curtain of war was rising. The Ghost Army would now perform their greatest masterpiece in the middle of a battlefield. Act 2. The Army That Wasn't There. War, as it turns out, is 90% waiting
9% confusion, and 1% convincing the enemy you're somewhere else entirely. For the men of the Ghost Army, that somewhere else was wherever the real divisions weren't. Their mission wasn't to attack, it was to pretend to make the Germans believe that a whole armored division was about to crash down on their flank, while in reality, the real one was slipping quietly behind them. Their first big test came after D-Day, when the Allies were pushing through the hedgerows of Normandy. German reconnaissance planes buzzed overhead daily, desperate to locate Patton's next move. So the Ghost Army rolled into a field with a truck full of rubber tanks and theater props. Within hours, they had transformed the quiet French countryside into what looked like a full-blown invasion force. The trick was in the detail. They didn't just park the tanks, they positioned them like a general would. They carved tire tracks into the mud, hung laundry to suggest off-duty soldiers, and even erected fake campfires made from flickering lanterns under canvas to imitate smoke. And the pièce de résistance? The sound. Sound engineers from Bell Labs had recorded actual tank convoys, artillery movements, and troop chatter using state-of-the-art for 1944 magnetic tape recorders. With massive speakers mounted on jeeps, they could blast the audio across an entire valley, the sound of an army on the move. One night, as they tested the system, a passing French farmer froze in terror when he heard tanks rumbling from the woods. "Les Américains sont partout," he shouted. "The Americans are everywhere." He wasn't wrong. Overhead, German scouts saw shadows of tanks and heard engines that shook the ground. They radioed back. "Enemy armor detected. Possible large formation moving west." The illusion had worked. Luftwaffe pilots dropped bombs on empty fields full of rubber and rope. The men of the Ghost Army cheered. The one artist, sipping cold coffee beside a deflated tank, muttered, "Imagine dying for a balloon." It wasn't a comfortable thought. Their work depended on the enemy believing the lie, but if the Germans ever sent a patrol to investigate, these artists would be standing on an open field with paintbrushes and phonographs instead of rifles. Still, for the first time, they saw how powerful art could be in the chaos of war. Their props had misled an entire German division. The line held. Lives were saved. From that day, the Ghost Army understood their strange purpose. They were not fighters, they were illusionists, drawing lines of light and sound across the map of Europe. They had become the army that wasn't there. Act 3. Masters of Sound and Shadow. By late 1944, the Ghost Army had become masters of the impossible, turning art into artillery, illusion into strategy. They had fooled the Germans once, but now the real test was consistency. Could they pull off a mirage over and over, under fire, without ever being caught? They were about to find out. Everywhere the Allies moved, the Ghost Army moved too, one step ahead, one lie at a time. They created entire phantom divisions to protect real troops. If the 9th Armored Division needed to sneak across a river, the Ghost Army would pretend to be the 9th 50 miles away, blasting fake radio traffic, positioning rubber tanks, and projecting recorded engine noise through massive loudspeakers. And oh, the sound work. It was a masterpiece. The sound engineers from Bell Labs, led by Sergeant John Jarvie, had collected over 500 unique sound effects. Tanks starting, trucks idling, machine gun drills, soldiers joking, even the clatter of mess kits. Using special mixers, they could combine these into what sounded like a 10,000-man operation. Each deception site had its own playlist, carefully mapped by acoustic engineers who calculated how sound traveled across valleys and forests. They even adjusted the bass so it matched the echo of distant hills. One sergeant bragged, "We could make a platoon sound like Patton's entire damn army." Meanwhile, the visual artists fine-tuned their craft.
They learned to paint fake unit numbers on trucks to match whatever division they were impersonating. They forged insignias, faked radio frequencies, even staged casual interactions with nearby towns, making sure the locals, and by extension German spies, would spread the word about a division that didn't exist. It was theater, not warfare. Broadway in a minefield. One night in France, an artist named Jack Massey, later a renowned designer for the U.S. Pavilion at World's Fairs, joked as he airbrushed an insignia on a Jeep. If Picasso had been drafted, he'd be here inflating tanks with us. Another replied, "Yeah, and charging admission." They laughed, but beneath the humor was tension. Their entire job depended on the illusion never breaking. If one German patrol stumbled upon an empty, rubber-made tank or caught the looped sound of an engine replaying every 12 minutes, it would be over, and the Ghost Army would be exposed as magicians playing soldiers. But the Germans never caught on. Each mission, they bit harder at the bait, shifting divisions, wasting artillery, and losing precious time. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops were proving something extraordinary, that art, when weaponized, could bend reality itself. They didn't just hide the truth, they replaced it. They had become, quite literally, the masters of sound and shadow.
Act 4. Operation Brest, the City of Ghosts. By August 1944, the liberation of France was in full swing. American forces were sweeping westward, aiming to reclaim the heavily fortified port city of Brest, a key U-boat base and Nazi stronghold. But General Omar Bradley had a problem. The Germans were dug in like ticks on a hound. If he sent the main division straight in, thousands could die in street-by-street fighting. So the call went out not to more infantry, but to the illusionists. The Ghost Army rolled toward the misty fields outside Brest under the cover of night, trucks loaded with air hoses, paint buckets, and rubber. It was time for their most daring stage play yet, to convince the Germans that the U.S. 6th Armored Division was preparing to assault from the east, while the real attack would come from another direction entirely. They had 72 hours to build an entire fake invasion force. The mornings began with the hiss of air pumps inflating Sherman tanks that looked oddly sleepy before fully erecting into life-size war machines. A few men joked that they were blowing up the war effort one puff at a time. Others strung camouflage nets, painted mud streaks on rubber hulls, and stomped fake tire tracks into the soil. One group handled the soundscape speakers mounted on jeeps, broadcasting the rhythmic thump of tank treads and the muffled shouts of imaginary soldiers. They even played recordings of engineers building pontoon bridges, suggesting the Americans were preparing a massive river crossing nearby. From a distance, it was flawless. From the sky, it was terrifying. German reconnaissance planes reported an armored division amassing east of Brest. The Nazi high command panicked. They repositioned artillery, shifted infantry, and fortified the wrong sector of the city. Meanwhile, the real American troops advanced from the opposite flank, catching the enemy completely off guard. When the first shots of the real assault rang out, the Ghost Army listened from miles away, their deception still humming in the background like a symphony of lies. They'd fooled the German 275th Infantry Division hook, line, and panzer. A young private, covered in dust and laughter, scribbled in his journal that night, "Some men storm beaches, we storm imaginations." But it wasn't all jokes. Every fake camp, every rubber tank, every speaker could draw enemy fire. A single artillery shell could burst their illusions and their lungs in seconds. They knew it, yet they carried on. For every bomb dropped on a decoy, a real soldier lived to see home again. When word reached headquarters that the deception had bought the Allies 2 full days of tactical advantage, Colonel Reeder simply nodded and said, "Gentlemen, art just won another battle." They didn't wear medals. They wore smiles of relief, knowing the best compliment was silence, the kind that followed a mission no one knew had happened. That night, they packed their rubber tanks, coiled their wires, and melted back into the dark, leaving behind nothing but footprints and ghosts.
Act 5. The artists in the crossfire. War has a way of blurring lines between truth and lies, courage and madness, art and survival. For the Ghost Army, that blur became painfully real in the autumn of 1944, when their illusions started drawing more than attention. They started drawing fire. It happened during Operation Bettenberg, near the Luxembourg border, a quiet valley that would soon turn into a theater of chaos. The real U.S. 4th Armored Division had just been ordered to move south. Their departure left a gaping hole in the Allied line, one that the Germans would pounce on if they noticed. So, once again, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops were told to perform the impossible: hold the line without any guns. They rolled in under cover of fog, setting up 30 inflatable tanks, trucks, and artillery in record time. The sound team positioned giant speakers in the woods, blasting a symphony of steel and thunder. Engines, voices, orders, even clanging mess kits. It was convincing. Too convincing. The next morning, the Germans took the bait and opened fire. Shells screamed overhead. The ground erupted. The Ghost Army froze. For the first time, the artists of illusion were facing real death for their fake war. Private Harold Dahl remembered crouching behind a rubber Sherman tank as shrapnel tore through it. "I guess the enemy finally found out we're full of hot air," he muttered, half laughing, half shaking. The joke made its rounds later, though no one laughed too hard. It was true. Some of the decoys burst into flames, others deflated pitifully like dying balloons at a carnival. But the German artillery didn't stop. They believed they were bombarding a full armored unit. Every minute the Ghost Army held their position, real American soldiers miles away gained time to regroup. Colonel Reeder ordered his men to stay low and keep the sound running. He said, "Make them believe it. If they're shooting at you, the plan is working." That grim logic became their armor. Hours later, when the shelling stopped, the Ghost Army crawled out from behind the wreckage. A few were wounded. Some of the sound trucks were gone, and the fields looked like a graveyard of melted rubber. But the line had held. The Germans, fooled by the illusion, hesitated to advance, fearing a massive U.S. counterattack that never existed. The men were shaken but alive. One sketch artist, staring at the ruins of a fake tank, muttered, "We're the only unit in the army we're getting blown up as proof you did your job." That night they buried the remains of their fallen comrades, pieces of rubber and canvas, with the same respect given to real soldiers. For them, it wasn't about glory. It was about the strange pride of saving lives through lies, of turning imagination into armor. The next morning, a new shipment of decoys arrived. The Ghost Army went right back to work. Because in a war full of blood and smoke, someone still had to paint the ghosts. Act 6. Voices in the Fog. By late 1944, the Ghost Army had learned that silence was overrated. Their newest mission didn't involve inflatable tanks or painted trucks. This time, their weapon was conversation, the kind of chatter that filled the airwaves of every army on Earth. The mission? Convince the Germans that U.S. divisions were massing where they weren't, through fake radio transmissions. It was called spoofing, and it was genius. Picture this: a tent in the middle of a rainy French forest, lanterns flickering, wires snaking across the mud. Inside sat a team of radio operators, tapping Morse code and sending encrypted messages on frequencies that German intelligence was known to monitor. Every word was fiction, but the Germans were listening as if it were gospel. The man behind much of this operation was Sergeant Ralph Ingersoll, a former journalist and master storyteller. He understood one thing better than most generals: that lies, told with confidence, sound like strategy. He and his crew studied real radio operators, their habits, pauses, even the quirks in their typing rhythms, until they could mimic entire divisions flawlessly. Each phantom division had its own radio fingerprint. They learned to scatter conversations, create believable logistics reports,
and even throw in fake complaints like, "This damn weather's slowing our fuel trucks again." Little details, real enough to be convincing, dull enough to be ignored. The result? German interceptors were soon mapping entire armies that existed only in the fog. At one point, a British intelligence officer monitoring U.S. communications heard the chatter and radioed a warning. "You've got an unauthorized division operating near Metz." The Americans smiled. "We know," they replied. "That's us." The Ghost Army had effectively become ventriloquists of war, throwing their voices across Europe, making ghosts speak, and leading the enemy in circles. But make no mistake, it was dangerous work. Radio trucks were prime targets for artillery, and if the Germans triangulated their position, those witty transmissions would turn into funerals. Private Paul Rankin recalled one night when German spotters began zeroing in. The team shut down their equipment, grabbed the transmitter, and bolted into the woods. He said, "We didn't stop running until we were halfway to Belgium, and even then, I swear I could still hear static chasing us." Still, the spoofing worked brilliantly. Entire German divisions were repositioned based on the chatter of men who didn't exist. Some nights, sitting in their tents, the operators joked about how strange it was. "We're probably the only soldiers who win battles by talking too much." The laughter would fade, replaced by the steady tick of Morse code, the heartbeat of an invisible army. The Ghost Army wasn't just deceiving the enemy anymore. They were rewriting the sound of war.
Act 7. Operation Viersen, The Great Illusion. By March 1945, the war in Europe was reaching its crescendo. The Allies had pushed deep into Germany, and the mighty Rhine River, the last natural barrier before the heart of the Reich, loomed ahead. Crossing it would be the final step toward victory, but also the deadliest. The Germans knew this too. They were watching, waiting, and ready to throw everything they had at any bridge or raft that dared to cross. So, once again, the call went out for the artists of deception. The Ghost Army was summoned for what would become their greatest illusion, Operation Viersen. Their task? To convince the Germans that the main Allied crossing of the Rhine would happen north of Dusseldorf, near the small town of Viersen, when in truth, the real crossing would take place more than 20 miles south at Remagen. It was a bluff on a scale never attempted before, and it had to be flawless. They arrived in a rainstorm, cold, mud up to their ankles, morale somewhere below sea level. But once they started, the familiar rhythm took over. Paint, inflate, broadcast, deceive. The men erected hundreds of inflatable Sherman tanks, artillery, and trucks, dotting the landscape like a mirage of steel. The camouflage unit dug fake foxholes, laid down tire tracks, and even scattered empty ration cans for realism. The sound unit rolled in with giant 500-pound loudspeakers, blasting recordings of tanks crossing pontoon bridges and trucks clattering across steel ramps. The sounds echoed through the valley for miles. Meanwhile, the radio deception team, the voice ghosts, created fake chatter for the 30th and 79th Divisions, making it seem like a massive assault force was gathering. Every few hours, a jeep with hand-painted division insignia drove casually through nearby towns to show that the area was crawling with troops. The soldiers even chatted with curious locals who, as intended, whispered the news to German informants. It worked beautifully. Within 2 days, German intelligence had taken the bait. Recon planes circled above, photographing the sprawling camp of rubber and sound. By the third day, enemy artillery was zeroing in, bombarding empty fields full of air and illusion. While the Ghost Army kept the Germans busy at Viersen, the real U.S. Ninth Army crossed the Rhine at Remagen with minimal resistance. It was a strategic masterpiece and one of the last great acts of deception in World War II.
When the real soldiers heard about the decoys, some laughed in disbelief. "You mean we crossed the Rhine because of a bunch of painters?" "Yes, but very committed painters," one Ghost Army man replied with a grin. The operation saved countless lives and sped up the Allied advance into Germany. And though the men celebrated with rations of cold coffee and canned peaches, they knew they had witnessed something historic. As dawn broke over the Rhine, one of them scribbled in his notebook, "The war will end soon, but somewhere a German general still believes we're camped outside Viersen." And in that moment, the Ghost Army achieved what few ever could. They'd fought a war, won, and left behind only echoes.
Act 8. The war ends, the secret begins. When the guns finally went silent in May 1945, the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops didn't march in victory parades or plant flags on captured cities. They just packed up their rubber tanks, coiled their wires, and folded away their ghosts. Europe was free. The Nazi regime had fallen. But the Ghost Army, the invisible division that had fooled Hitler's generals, faded quietly back into the mist they came from. They were forbidden to talk about what they'd done. Not to reporters, not to their families, not even to other soldiers. Their mission, the U.S. Army said, was classified. For them, the war didn't end with peace, it ended with silence. When the unit disbanded in September 1945, the men were handed routine discharge papers. No medals, no commendations, no mention of the operations that saved tens of thousands of lives. Many went home to their art studios, advertising jobs, and small-town lives blending back into the very world they'd once disguised. Bill Blass, who designed camouflage for decoy tanks, returned to fashion design and later became one of America's most famous couturiers. Jack Macy, the set designer turned deception expert, joined the U.S. Information Agency and spent decades shaping the way America presented itself to the world. Arthur Shilstone, who once painted fake insignias in France, went on to illustrate for National Geographic and Life magazine. But none of them could tell the full truth. At dinner tables and class reunions, when someone asked, "So, what did you do in the war?" they'd shrug and say, "Oh, I was in special operations." And that was that. In the years after the war, the Ghost Army became a rumor, a whisper among veterans. Some dismissed it as myth, others as soldiers' bar talk. Inflatable tanks? Recorded battles? Come on, skeptics laughed. And yet, hidden in classified archives were reports stamped top secret, detailing every fake division, every sound map, every illusion that fooled the Nazis. The men carried that secret like an invisible medal pinned to their hearts. One veteran, decades later, said, "We saved thousands of men, but we couldn't tell a soul. Our victory was invisible, just like our army." It wasn't until 1996, 51 years after the war, that the U.S. government finally declassified the Ghost Army's missions. By then, most of the men were grandfathers. Some were gone. Those who remained could finally speak, and America finally listened. When the news broke, journalists were stunned. How had such a monumental operation stayed hidden for so long? And the veterans, humble as ever, just smiled and said, "We were good at keeping secrets."
Act 9. The long silence breaks. For 50 years, the Ghost Army lived as a rumor, an invisible legend that slipped through the cracks of official history. Then, one day, the ghosts began to speak. It started quietly in the 1990s, when a few curious historians and surviving veterans began digging through the U.S. National Archives. What they found stunned them. Dusty files stamped top secret,
photographs of inflatable tanks, blueprints of fake camps, and handwritten reports describing how illusion had won real battles. The truth, after half a century, had come back to life. When the story broke in 1996, the world could hardly believe it. Major newspapers ran headlines like "The Artists Who Fooled Hitler" and "America's Secret Army of Illusion." TV crews rushed to interview the surviving men, now white-haired, soft-spoken, and slightly bewildered by the sudden fame. One veteran, Sergeant John Jarvie, smiled on camera and said, "Back then, I couldn't tell my wife what I did for the Army. I told her I was in radio repair. Turns out, I was repairing reality." The laughter that followed was mixed with tears. Families who'd never known the truth about their father's wartime service sat watching the documentaries, realizing that the quiet man who painted in the garage every Sunday had once fooled the Nazi war machine. Museums and art galleries began displaying Ghost Army artifacts, the sketches, the sound recordings, even a few of the surviving rubber tanks. Visitors stared in disbelief. "They fought a war with balloons?" someone whispered. A veteran standing nearby chuckled. "No," he said, "we fought a war with ideas." The public fell in love with the story. It had everything: courage, creativity, absurdity, and heart. It showed that victory wasn't just about firepower, it was about imagination. The Ghost Army had proven that art could be as powerful as ammunition. In 2013, Congress began reviewing a bill to officially honor the unit. But bureaucracy moves slower than war, and it would take years before recognition arrived. Still, the surviving members didn't seem bitter. They had waited half a lifetime. What was a few more years? "Let the world catch up," one said, smiling. "We were always ahead of it anyway." As more stories emerged, the veterans reunited. In one emotional gathering, men who hadn't seen each other since 1945 embraced, laughing and crying in equal measure. They shared sketches, letters, and stories of near disaster, like the night an inflatable tank rolled away in the wind and crashed into a French farmhouse. "Technically," one joked, "it was our only confirmed kill." These reunions weren't just nostalgia, they were closure. After decades of invisibility, the ghosts were finally seen. When asked what he wanted the world to remember, one old soldier paused for a long moment, then said quietly, "We weren't heroes. We were just kids with paint and courage. But sometimes that's enough to change history." And with that, the Ghost Army finally stepped out of the shadows, their story now a testament to the strange, beautiful truth that creativity can save lives.
Act 10. Legacy of the Invisible. Some wars are won by firepower, some by faith. But the Ghost Army proved that a war could also be won by imagination. Nearly 8 decades after their secret campaign across Europe, the legacy of the Ghost Army endures, not in monuments or battlefields, but in the quiet awe of those who hear their story for the first time. When the final declassification papers were released, historians estimated that their deceptions, from Normandy to the Rhine, saved the lives of 30,000 American soldiers. 30,000 men who went home, raised families, built futures, all because a handful of artists, engineers, and dreamers made the enemy look the wrong way. Yet, for the men who lived it, the recognition came slowly. They never sought fame. They only wanted the truth recorded before time erased them completely. And at last, it came. On February 1st, 2022, the U.S. Congress passed the Ghost Army Congressional Gold Medal Act, one of the highest civilian honors in the nation. When the surviving members gathered for the ceremony in Washington, D.C., they stood frail but proud as the medal was unveiled, gleaming under the lights. Engraved on it were the words, "Deceive, defend, save lives." For the first time in 77 years, their country publicly said, "Thank you." At the podium, 99-year-old veteran Bernard Bluestein adjusted his glasses and said softly, "We never thought anyone would find out what we did, but maybe it's good they did to remind the world that art can serve peace just as much as war." The audience rose to its feet, not because of explosions or victories, but because of a truth so human it transcended war itself, that creativity, when guided by courage, can be a weapon more powerful than hate. Today, the Ghost Army's story lives on in museums, documentaries, and classrooms. Artists quote them, generals study them, filmmakers adore them. Their techniques, the manipulation of sound, shadow, and psychology, became the foundation for modern military deception and psychological operations. But beyond tactics, they left a deeper lesson. The imagination of a few can protect the lives of many. They showed that victory is not always loud. Sometimes it whispers through static. Sometimes it de-inflates quietly under the moonlight. Sometimes it's invisible. As the credits of history roll, the Ghost Army fades once more into the mist, but this time, not forgotten. They remain there between truth and illusion, forever painting on the canvas of memory. Because heroes don't always fire bullets. Sometimes they just make sure the enemy is shooting at ghosts. They fought with sound instead of bullets. They painted tanks that never fired a shot and saved thousands who would have. The Ghost Army reminds us that war is not only fought on battlefields, but in the mind. And sometimes the sharpest weapon of all is creativity.